Hello and welcome everyone to another amazing video brought to you by FM Daniel Wrench and Chess.com. We are here again to continue our series in the Principle of Two Weaknesses mindset or mastery, whatever you want to call it. The basic concepts, of course, being that against tough defense and with small advantage positions, without the right approach, we're talking about this patient, disciplined approach of trying to find a second target. And basically, as we get more advanced, what this really is, you can call it outplaying your opponent still. The game is not over just because black is up a pawn and he has the bishop here. And like I alluded to in our first video, if you watched it, a lot of people sort of play with the mindset that, you know, when they're winning, the game is now over, they can just exchange. This is something that was sort of put in our subconscious by our coaches when we were young. And of course, the reason why they did that is because, you know, the only thing we recognized as an advantage back then was like a whole rook or a piece or something, you know. And so in those cases, yeah, most of the time, just about any exchange probably helps you. But you'd be surprised, although it sounds basic, this is something that people approach their positions with a lot and have the wrong psychology and then wonder why they weren't able to win a small advantage position. And that's because the game wasn't over yet. You needed to continue to outplay your opponent. Something about the beauty of chess, the dynamics of the game, that even being up a pawn, you know, which is a big advantage at a high level, but without continued what do you want to call it, grinding, without continue trying to outplay your opponent and still do some hard work over the board, you may not be able to win those games. Okay, so here we're looking at a position where white has, this is a famous game actually, or at least famous in my eyes. I was taught it by one of my mentors, Yermolinsky. Grandmaster Yermolinsky was black in this game against someone else. We'll keep no one's names for the witness protection program or something like that, right? So anyway, Yermolinsky was black here, and the good question is, how does black win this position? Okay, so again, we have an extra pawn. You have the bishop pair. But the practical, you know, ideas of how to win this are actually pretty difficult because, again, what you'll notice is that the knight and bishop have set up sort of a blockade on the queen side because the knight holds the dark square entry, and even if black was to push this pawn, the idea of trying to bring this king up will always run into this discovery. Unless, of course, you create another problem for me, obviously, right? The whole theme of our idea, Principle of Two Weaknesses. So if you're to commit to this idea, you have to calculate whether or not you're ready for a discovery, whether it be winning a piece or a pawn or something like that, and whether or not you're okay with that risk. So, again, even though it doesn't look like it at first, white actually has a blockade here because black doesn't really have any safe points of entry, at least in the sense of safe meaning, you know, you could do this with your eyes closed. There's going to be some calculation. You're going to be risking giving some of your material back at the very least because this pawn isn't going anywhere. So at the very least, there will be a discovery to win that pawn. So what is the right approach here? What did Grandmaster Yermolinsky do, and where are white's second weaknesses? Well, hopefully some of you have watched our first video on this topic and kind of what the right approach is, what the right ways to think are in terms of what exchanges do you want to make, what are your goals, building a bridge calculation, recognizing where you want to be on the other side of the bridge, all this stuff. And I won't give my crazy analogies again, but hopefully, you know, we've watched that and kind of seen what that means. And so what I would ask you to think about here is what are the differences between black and white's position, besides, you know, the obvious thing. Like, think about some of the differences and what some logical things are that maybe we overlook in trying to just calculate before you try to solve the position. So go ahead, take a couple minutes here. I would suggest you take a few minutes and try to think about this position and decide on what black's best plan should be. Okay, we're going to assume that you did that, and I'm going to point out right away what the real problem is here for white. The real problem here for white, and this is an advanced idea. I've given this position to 2,200 players who maybe did a pretty decent job trying to win and improve black's advantage, you know, because they're very good players, but really miss kind of what the key idea is, which is what black's second target is, what white's second weaknesses are, which are these pawns on dark squares. Now, the reason why I asked you to ask yourself what the differences are is because the only difference really between white and black's position, besides this extra pawn, but we've just sort of discussed that it's difficult to make progress with that as of now. And by the way, I mean, you're not going to make this trade, I hope, because obfuscate bishop endings do not improve your winning chances, as we talked about. And also here it's even worse because your pawns are really fixed on light squares, which means the chances of you coming over here without allowing some serious counterplay are slim to none. You're not going to be able to do it. So you shouldn't even consider that exchange. However, the really only real difference here is the knight and the bishop. Because these two bishops are the same color, okay, we don't really consider that a major difference. But one major difference is what this bishop does versus what this knight does. Both will have their advantages, blah, 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 all fair and equal to all men, right, all that stuff. But the truth is the bishop is a much better piece if you find the right idea, which is bishop to e1 at some point, targeting the g3 pawn and the h4 pawn. Now, you won't do that right away because the e5 pawn is hanging, but that's a pretty quick fix, whether it be pushing this pawn forward or bringing your king forward. But once you recognize that his second target, his second weakness that's going to make his life, a living hell, is the fact that he can't defend those pawns. Pawns can't go back, right? And these are the sort of positional things that the grandmasters sort of know quickly. They don't even really have to train their brain to try to solve it in the game anymore. They're just always recognizing what is permanent in both sides' positions, what you can target, what you can take advantage of, because that's how you outplay somebody. Not hope chess, not tactics, but you outplay somebody by attacking this strategy. Tactics serve strategy, and then you go from there. So that's one of the real problems for white, is the dark square pawns. Maybe he's not going to win both, but at least trying to create a problem over there is where we need to head. So in the game, Grandmaster Yermolinsky played king to g7. White played bishop d3, and he played f6. He probably could have played f5 a little bit more aggressively, and we'll talk about that. But I think he was trying to be patient and taking all his options. Again, remember my maximize theory, which is don't be afraid to leave your opponent in a bad position while you figure out what your maximum strategy is, because guess what? When people are in bad positions, they panic, they get frustrated, they think about going to the casino, they start thinking about what their wife said to them on the phone, and you're just sitting there, like Alexander Alyahin said. He said that he always would adjourn a game even in a lost position because you never know, his opponent might die overnight. Now, that's pretty cynical, obviously, but the point is that you never know, right? So leave your opponent in a bad position. Let him think about it for a little bit. Remember that. So after the bishop went back to e2, he had a decision to make. Two approaches here. One is to try and play g5. Now, the idea behind g5 is pretty simple in that either A, you're going to take here, which is going to create this permanent target on h4, and either bishop e1 or the bishop can relocate somewhere else. But actually, I guess that is kind of the only diagonal to attack the pawn, which is probably why Yermolinsky didn't go for it, because this king can sit on f1 and try to focus on preventing that idea. Maybe the position is still lost with some great technique, but much more difficult. Also, the fact that if white takes it, you have an outside pass pawn, which is certainly a second advantage, but you haven't really won any material yet. And I think what Yermolinsky calculated was an opportunity to really create a problem here, which was this move f5. Now, what f5 does is very interesting, because now if you take it, you're creating a position where black immediately has an opportunity for a second pass pawn, and he hasn't taken away any of your weaknesses. So the chance of you defending both those pawns and not allowing this bishop at some point to get frisky over there on those pawns is not very good. But the problem is if he doesn't take it, as what happened in the game, he moved his knight, sort of being patient. This move comes in. Bam, f4. f4, unlike the g5 idea, even though it allows a trade, here we make a trade, but we leave white with this weakness. Now notice that by Yermolinsky's approach, he didn't end up in a situation where the only access point to the pawn was this diagonal. What other access point has he just created? Well, obviously this diagonal. Doesn't mean he's going to do it right away, but he just created more problems for white in terms of guarding that pawn. And also, by achieving this pawn on f4, combined with the power of the bishop on this diagonal, how is this king going to defend that pawn? The answer is he's not going to. He's not going to be able to do that. So f4 is an exclamovich, as I invented. And don't let anybody else tell you they invented that word. I invented exclamovich. Okay? Just remember that. Now, with that being said, so f4 was played. White has two major approaches. He can try to play bishop c4, which is a way to trade the position and maybe hope that without the bishop pair, his defense is going to get easier. It doesn't really. Or he can, again, try to sit on the position either by just waiting here or playing g4. G4, I think, is the best try, because what g4 does is blocks this diagonal of the bishop, so at the very least, this king now has a safe point, a safe house to guard that pawn. But before we get to g4, let's ask ourselves, what if our opponent offers an exchange? Are we going to make that exchange, or are we not going to make that exchange? Based on everything I've taught you so far, think about this position here. Do some calculation. Always do some calculation. Take some pause. But think about whether or not you're going to make that exchange. Go ahead. Okay, we're going to assume that you took a pause and did some real hard work. And if you've done that hard work, hopefully you came up with the idea that we are not going to make that exchange. We are going to keep our opponent in a bad position, because when people are in bad positions, they make bad decisions. Okay? It's just like the illusion that people only blunder and they say, oh, how many times have you heard, if you're a coach out there, your student comes up and says, if I had just blundered my queen, or maybe you even tell that to yourself. A lot of, I have students who do that, and, I'm not saying we don't make big blunders. I mean, I just played a tournament where I made several blunders, so, we're all human. But the majority of the time, in fact, I would say 95% of the time, when you make a blunder, you were already in a bad position to begin with. Now, you can be honest with yourself and try to look at where you got outplayed, what you didn't understand about the pawn structure, the opening, this, that. The more critical you are, of course, the more progress you're going to make. That's just, fact of life. But, or you can tell yourself, oh, if I just hadn't made that, queen hanging on move 19, I would have been totally fine, right? Well, actually, the fact that you hung your queen, 95% of the time, you are in a bad position. In fact, the only percentage of the time, it doesn't even really break my rule, because the only percentage of time you were in a bad position, at the very least, you were probably thinking about something you should have been thinking about. Lack of focus, or maybe you chose the wrong plan. You were better, but you didn't understand how to approach the position. That's just the truth. I mean, when we're on the right path and we understand how the position should be played and what we're going to do to win, those types of blunders in a winning position are few and far between. 0.001% or something. It just doesn't happen, especially as you get better. So, keep your opponent in a bad position. Make him deal with this diagonal. How is he going to deal with this and the threats here? How's he going to do it? I don't know. So keep him there. You can make the trade on c4. Probably the best way to do it is king f6, actually. I have some analysis here on that, which is that, if you play king f6, he makes this trade and comes back with the knight. You go to e1 and you force this trade. He's got to go here and defend. But the trade of the pieces, although you are winning here, hasn't necessarily improved your winning chances, that's for sure. And when you start making progress here, the one thing that this knight does well is it holds the light square. So when you try to come out, you're risking at some point him running his own passed pawn down your throat. Now, this position is winning. And with the right technique, we're not going to look at everything here, but black should be winning this position. But the point is that after bishop d7, rather than going into this line, after bishop d7, you haven't changed your winning strategy any, which means you don't have to calculate anything new, and you've left him dealing with the same problem he was dealing with. So e takes f4, e takes, he plays knight b7. Again, this is his idea. He's trying to create controversy because he's losing. That's what you do when you're losing. You create controversy. Bishop b3, king f6. He waits a little bit, but now we start bringing the king over here. And in the process of creating that controversy, what he didn't realize was that he got his knight trapped. And by the way, there was nothing else he could do besides wait, because if the king did try to run over, what's going to happen at some point? Obviously, people, it's pretty, we're going to win. And that's, as a result of us having the right plan, which is this principle of two weaknesses, right approach. Think about what is permanently weak in your opponent's position and then target it. Stop playing hope chess. So, after f5 was played, bishop d3, knight d6 and f4, g4 was actually played in the game, which I think was the best defense. But black went ahead and took his opportunity to play bishop e1. And now white kind of changed his mind of why he played g4. Instead of putting the king on h3 in the game, white played g takes h5. We're going to look at why that lost real quick. After g takes, he played bishop d3, sort of just sitting on the position. Well, his hope here was that you would take, and after check, he would be forcing the opposite colored bishop ending by forking the pieces. But it should be noted that even this type of opposite colored bishop ending might be winning, because with two passed pawns, very difficult. However, the fact that he has his own passed pawn and can sit with the bishop on e4, guarding the c2 square and guarding his pawn, is going to make your winning chances very difficult. Maybe it's not winning. Maybe I'm just blowing smoke here. So, either way, not worth the calculation. And again, it's good to note how he avoided the opposite bishop ending and played king f6. After knight f5, played c5, which was an exclam, reminding white that he does still have a passed pawn on c6. The h-pawn is not the only weakness. Again, principle of two weaknesses. So, after that, king f1 was played. The bishop went to g3, and now he's going to have to choose. Either A, he tries to come back, where several winning ideas, but one of them is bishop to b3, followed by the march of the pawn. A very common idea to put your bishop in front of the passed pawn, especially in same-colored bishop endings. Or he can take it, and again, the problem there is that he's going to have to guard the g3 pawn, and bishop b3 was played. So, g takes h5, lost the game. In fact, I think white resigned after takes, king here, bishop b3, white resigned. So, the game was easily winning. Again, our approach of principle of two weaknesses, these advantages, is what won us the game. What if white had put up a little bit tougher defense and played king h3? Well, don't lose your head here. We're still winning, and the key move is king f6 exclam, doing two things. One, you're reminding him that you do have the ability to go over here, and with the bishop on this diagonal and bishop on this diagonal, he's not improving anything on the king side. That's for sure. I mean, his defense is pretty stuck. So by playing king f6, if he was to give some sort of check or something, you might just start, making him run for it over here and start to get crazy with it. Or if he doesn't do that, the other threat you have after king f6, white could play knight c4 and c5. This is our analysis kind of based on what we think the best defense might have been for white waiting, is to play g5. The idea after g5 is that when he takes the pawn, you're going to take it, and not only there do you have the threat of h4, which is a pretty strong pawn, but also you have the threat of taking. And after this g-pawn is created as a weakness, the bishop will have to guard the diagonal and the g-pawn, making his life much more difficult to do. So, after g5 was played, white played knight to d5 check. That was the idea behind knight b6. Try to get an obstacle bishop ending again. But again, black says, no way, Hoser. And after knight c7, plays bishop d7. Excuse me. Takes king g6. Knight a6, h takes g4, f takes g4, bishop f2. White's creating controversy, but we have our goal in mind. Never forgetting about the c-pawn and targeting our second weakness. So when your opponent creates these little tactics, don't miss them, but, you're not panicking when you're building a bridge calculation. You've got your goal in mind. What's the big deal? He's going to do his little things here and try to think that he's actually defending the position. But now, as we said, we have created this second weakness on g4. We play bishop to f7 first, which threatens this. And let's say even if he did come back with the idea of going after that, even this move is winning here, going after the g-pawn and easily winning. So, playing g4, even with the idea of saving the king this h3 square, would not be good enough. After bishop e1, king up, and we start to activate our king again. The balance of both sides of the board and how we do that is key, and you'll notice in all the winning lines, that was what black was doing. So white was unable to defend the position, and went on to lose the game. Because of that, we've looked at all the critical lines here. So hopefully you've taken in a lot of our ideas and sort of re-cementing into your brain what your right approach should be psychologically, and even these little funny stories I tell, but really, psychologically, you want to have that right approach about keeping your opponent in a bad position, and it's the right practical approach for time pressure. Might as well get him under time pressure. And it's also the right approach where if you're not ready to calculate a deep win, then, improve your position with balance, recognize how to use this principle of two weaknesses, and the way you do that is by focusing on what is permanently weak in your opponent's position. To start out, what was permanently weak were these guys. So black developed a plan around the dark squares, and it got better as he went. What's interesting is after he moved, he could have played for the g5 idea, and we have some analysis on that. But again, he recognized what the best ways were to do it. And after you recognize your goal, where you want to get to, the rest is just building a bridge. You come to the river, you got to get to the other side, and you're going to calculate and build the bridge along the way. But you got to recognize your goal and what was weak in his position, and what you could do to really create some problems for his defense. Now, with all that being said, I do want to show one last thing, which is kind of where we start to contradict ourselves. But one thing that's interesting is that the straight calculation method, or the concrete calculation method, not this essence of the position stuff, but this straight calculation method of coming to this side of the board is definitely worthy of note, with the idea being that if you calculate to here and see this move, what you'll notice is that when he takes this pawn, you push and both pieces are hanging. Even if he's in a situation, let's say he would manage to get, let's say we moved our bishop first to protect, and even if he was in this situation, the way the timing worked, he could have gone here and here. After taking in c4, white doesn't really have the time to create controversy over here with the king rushing and the pawns rushing. He's going to be giving up a piece. Now, he's going to have a pawn forward, and he's going to be playing this position and trying to defend. And so Grandmaster Yermolinsky decided not to go for this type of long approach over here, despite the fact that with conquer calculation, it was probably winning. Excuse me. The good thing to note about that is the psychological concepts of the principle of two weaknesses and how to use it, and that straight calculation is always good, and we always encourage that, and it's the way that the best chess players play. But a balance, and in a practical sense, you're going to have a lot of games where you have to calculate deeply, and you have to see that discovery idea, and whether you like it or not, your advantage isn't big enough to just play patiently in principle of two weaknesses like Danny says. It's not a perfect world, right? So when you're in those situations, you need to calculate and be ready to take a risk. That's why I wanted to show that example of another way you could have won the position. However, because you're going to have many of those games, I have many games where I have to work hard. So if I have a game where I can approach the position taking advantage of some permanent weaknesses and really have a nice, clean, principle of two weaknesses approach, patient and effective, that's the best way to go, and that's psychologically the best way for black to approach this position, even though I wanted to show you guys that idea of bringing the king over to win. So, thank you again, and that was another video brought to you by Chess.com, and have a wonderful time, and a wonderful day, and a wonderful life.